The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Supernatural, metaphysical, paranormal. You know, all those things you've been wondering about? Are you ready to go deeper into the realms of the unknown? I hope you've got your walking shoes on, because life is an adventure, and this is the journey. Come on, let's go. Hello and welcome to the show, everyone. This is the Journey Radio Show, and hey, we're the She-Squatchers. I'm Jen Cruz, your host, and I've got my trusty teammates on the line. I've got Jenna Grover.
Well, hello.
Hi, Jenna. And I've got Tammy, but I think Tammy's having an audio problem. So anybody who gets to watch it on video gets to look at Tammy, but she might be the strong silent type tonight.
Oh, funny, Jen.
She will probably keep working on it and see if she can bless us with her voice. But regardless of that, she's here. She's looking gorgeous. She's waving hello to everybody and sending hearts, hearts, hearts. So, and we've got a great guest for you tonight. We've got Jeff Harding returning to us. He is living in both Minnesota and South Dakota. And he's been on our show before, and I'm just going to give you a quick reminder. He was kayaking up a river 8 miles every single week to leave items in a Bigfoot area in the attempt to collect DNA and see if he could get some information from that when they started to trust him. So welcome, Jeff. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate you inviting me back. You set me free and I returned. So
yay.
Oh, wow. That's so sweet.
Glad you came back. We're glad to have you. We've been wanting to know ever since, you'd been kayaking up that river and you'd been leaving the items to collect DNA and not bringing any equipment in there so that they might learn to trust you, and returning the next day to collect those evidence, the things that you had left behind, the ball and whatever else you had left behind that week. How did that end up with your great betrayal?
Well, you always, I guess you kind of get pre-programmed to think either something's going to be a success or it's going to fail, or, it's going to be A or B, right? You never really plan on, is it going to be C or is there another option? What am I missing something here? And that's kind of what happened with this situation. I really felt like the way me and my research partner, Doug Hajicek, had designed the research for this area, which was a very remote clearing in the Pine Island Forest up in northern Minnesota, not far from your old stomping grounds, Jan, up at the Red Lake area. I never wanted, when I was here last week, couldn't talk exactly where it was, right? I didn't want people piling in there, but it was on the Clearwater River that comes out of Clearwater Lake. It's just there's one little area that you tend to hear a lot about sightings at, and it's south of the Red Lake area by what's called Debs, Minnesota. And there's been like 5 to 7 encounters there in the last 5 to 10 years in this Debs, Minnesota area. We decided, like you said, we didn't know what Sasquatch is capable of. Can it sense an IR signal? Can it see a UV coating on a camera lens with UV in a UV vision spectrum? Can it sense a battery presence? Everybody's got theories of that, but we decided, since we really don't know, let's not incorporate any of that. Let's just simply try to leverage its curiosity in an area that we knew that we felt they were, and see if we could leave items that it would feel comfortable with over time, interacting with, touching, moving, whatever. And we tried different clearings in this area until finally I had left a ball that I'd play with the ball for half an hour and leave it and come back the next day and see if it's moved. Eventually it was moved like 80 some yards. And then we started putting Velcro tabs on the ball and started leaving different items that were meant to collect skin oil samples or hair samples if it was interacted with. In over 37 weeks, we collected, I believe it was 26 total hair samples and 13 skin oil samples. And there was only 5 weeks of those 37 weeks in which we didn't have items that were moved or interacted with. So it was, we kind of became part of a routine, so to speak. I went every Thursday morning, kayaked 8.5 miles in, reached this area. I'd hike about 3/4 of a mile into the clearing, use these different items or play with them, laugh at them, never did any wood knocking, never called, just had fun with these items, and then appeared to have forgotten them and left. And the next day I'd go back and collect them. And then we'd wait a week. And then on Thursday morning, I'd go do it again. So I didn't know if these individuals that were interacting with them habitated right there or not. They could habitate 20 miles away, but they, for whatever reason, they started expecting that we were coming there every Thursday. So we became part of a routine. And we were highly successful in doing what we set out, which was collecting samples to test for the Legend Meets Science 2 documentary that will eventually be coming out from Doug and Justin and those guys. In doing this, since we never incorporated anything battery-wise or camera-wise, one of the items that we were leaving a lot were game trail cameras that didn't have batteries in them. And the idea was, let's get it comfortable picking that up and moving it around or touching it. And so I painted one fluorescent blue completely, and it had a strap, a Velcro strap on it, and we'd leave it laying in the grass after I'd move it around. Or we'd strap it to a tree and put a little baby food jar with a piece of Biddle honey candy in it or a polished rock in it underneath of it. And there was a time when it was moved like 20 yards in the grass from one location to another. There's another time where it was picked up in about, it's probably about 35, 40 yards away from where I left it. It was hanging from a branch in a tree, just like dangling there as if it's something that just set it up on the branch. So what we felt was at the end, if it was going to get so comfortable moving around, and we didn't know if we had one individual or more than one. We discovered partway through that it was more than one. But the idea was to leverage this curiosity to a point to where at the very end, everything would change. We'd have the place loaded. That last visit wouldn't be bringing a 15-inch rubber ball out there. It would be a 15-inch foam core with 4 lipstick 4K cameras in it with a lithium battery that was plastic coated in red, so it looked like that red ball. But that's what would be sitting in the clearing. And perhaps if it left the tree line and walked towards the ball thinking it's the same ball it's always kicking around or picking up and moving, maybe it would get halfway there and sense something's wrong, but by then it's already on camera, you know? So in our mind, it was a pass-fail thing. Either we're going to get this thing on audio or on camera, or we're not. What happened was there were some things that were leading up those last couple of weeks. At one point, my trailer was actually unhooked from my vehicle while I was kayaking. And when I returned, my trailer was gone. And I thought, well, that seems odd. So I called my neighbor and said, can you come up here and help me get my kayak home? I had a sport utility. Said somebody stole my trailer at the launch point by the bridge at this river. And he says, okay. And he's leaving his house. He knew where I was at. He's the only person I'd ever really included in the location of this place. 2-3 minutes later, he calls me back and says, dude, your trailer's parked in your driveway. And I'm thinking, there's no way my trailer's parked in my driveway. I mean, I live like 45 minutes away from where this launch point is. And he said, it's there right now. And I said, take a picture of it and send it to me. And he did. And sure enough, it's my trailer. And he said, do you want me to hook it up? I said, no, just come up here. And he came up with his truck and we loaded my kayak in it and went back and looked. And my trailer's parked in my driveway, but the license plate was gone. And that just seemed odd. A couple weeks before that, when I showed up at my lake home, I was standing in the driveway loading up the kayak in my trailer out of our shop. And I noticed there was a vehicle parked at the end of my driveway with 2 people in it, and they took my picture and drove away. And I thought that was odd, because we kind of live on a cul-de-sac area of this lake. There's little things like this happening that on its own, it doesn't seem that odd, but as they were adding up, it's like, what's going on here? I'm not the typical conspiracy theorist guy. I really don't get too heavily into that. I get where, whether you want to talk about UFOs, aliens, whatever, maybe there's some Men in Black Area 51 type stuff that intervenes in that. But I never really attributed to anything like that to what we were doing. But as these things kept happening, I kept wondering what's going on here. There was one morning where I was kayaking up a couple of weeks leading into that last week where I could hear a drone flying over me. And I had a handheld FLIR C5. And on my kayak, I have an iPad, an 11-inch iPad mounted on a ram mount so that if I ever heard something wood knock to the side of me, I wouldn't have to turn my head to look at it. I could just hold the FLIR C5 aiming at it and it would show up on my iPad. Anywhere I aimed, it would show up on the iPad. So as I'm going, I'm holding it up in the air and I can see the lithium battery glowing on a drone that's flying above me. And we're so remote where this is at. I thought, where would this person be flying this from? It just seemed odd. So all these little things kept adding up. And I kept telling Doug about it. And I said, I don't get what's going on. He said, yeah, he goes, this is, but we're not doing anything illegal, so let's just keep going through the process of doing what we've been doing. And that last week, I kayaked up in there. And right when I pulled my kayak up, I have about a 3/4 mile walk back through this game trail through some heavily wooded area of pines and poplar and some birch to get back to where the clearing is. And right away, I could smell like it smelled like Chemlon had been to your house, like an ammonia smell. And that seemed odd to me. And as I kept walking back towards the clearing, it kept getting stronger. And I'm carrying the ball with the camera traps in it. I'm carrying some Zoom audio recorders that we're going to leave out there. And I got back there and it was just like, my head was just pounding from the smell. It was pretty overpowering. And I walked around the whole perimeter of this clearing, which is about 90 yards long by about 70 yards wide. It's kind of an oval shape. There's woods all the way around it. And I could smell it everywhere. And so I had went out and rolled the ball around, played with it a little bit, and left it right where we intended to leave it. And left the Zoom recorders out there. And I pulled several handfuls of this grass and stuffed it into my backpack because I thought from different areas of the clearing, I want to have this tested and see what it smells like. Something was sprayed all over this, but it's such a large area. It didn't seem possible to go in there like with a backpack sprayer and spray it. I mean, you'd almost have to aerial spray it. And then when I was kayaking out, the whole way back, I had a headache from this. The next morning, I paddled up there and nothing had been moved, collected it all up. It still stunk like it did the day before. I grabbed some more grass samples from different areas. And on my paddle out, I checked 4 different clearings that we had looked at prior to choosing this one. I mean, we had played with the ball in different clearings thinking maybe this would be a good spot. And it was this 5th clearing that had actually got moved. And that's why we chose that area. But going downriver, there were other clearings that I had tried that technique to see if I could get the ball moved in. I walked into those clearings to see if any of them smelled like that. Like maybe the forestry the state was out there doing weed control or something. I couldn't find, none of these other clearings had smelled like that. And so the grass samples, we've got those being tested now to see was something sprayed there on purpose to like try to ruin the momentum of what we had going on there. And to this day, I don't know. I don't claim that it was a Men in Black thing. I don't know if it's other researchers who knew where we were or somebody just screwing around with us. I really, or even this is part of the Pine Island Forest, so it's not private land, but maybe there's an adjacent landowner that came in there and did some type of weed control, but it was just dead in the water at that point. So we were successful in getting all the DNA samples that we had wanted to do. It was way more successful than we thought we'd be. But the whole idea of, I was really optimistic that we had a good chance at getting this thing on camera because we had interaction every week after that. Except, like I say, out of 37 weeks, there's only 5 weeks where we didn't have something moved or interacted with. So kind of a letdown.
That is so disappointing, especially for you after doing all of that hard work, kayaking up there and dragging your kayak across the dry river.
Well, I still believe it was worth it because the DNA samples, we had come up with a technique, a low-tech technique that was not threatening. I mean, like I say, not just the things that we'd leave, but the whole idea of, if something wood knocks at me, I'm not going to wood knock back at it. I don't want to think I'm trying to communicate to it, reach out to it. If I hear something break a branch, I'm not going to stand there and look around at the tree line and try to figure out what it was. I'm going to put my head down and keep walking. That was the idea of letting it feel like this guy is completely not a threat to me. Whatever he leaves, whether it's 5 minutes after I've left the area or the middle of the night that night, I kind of gave it a 24-hour window. I wasn't sure when it would come out and interact with what we left, but it always seemed to do it, right? And I think a lot of what led to that was I wasn't trying to, vocalize to it, not understanding what I'd be saying, And since then, I've talked to other researchers who've kind of adapted that. Like if they hear something wood knock and then they hear a double wood knock in a different direction, don't get involved in that. Don't wood knock with it. Let them communicate with each other so that it keeps on going rather than you knocking one time and all of a sudden you've ruined the whole conversation. They don't want to do it anymore, right? I guess I'd liken it to if we all went to an Asian restaurant for dinner and I didn't speak Cantonese or whatever, Japanese, and 2 waiters were talking, would I go and try to mimic what they're saying, not understand what I'm saying? Why would I do that? But in essence, maybe that's what we're doing sometimes when we're trying to vocalize or wood knock and not understand what they're communicating with each other,
That makes a lot of sense.
If there's not a question in the chat room, I would love to ask one. You mentioned all of these samples that you were getting tested, and I know for a lot of people that's very, very expensive. Do you have a contact that you're doing this with or do you have?
Yeah. So the system that Doug had set up for specifically the testing we were doing for Legend Meat Science 2, one thing we didn't want to do is inadvertently duplicate maybe what Melba Ketchum had done, where all of a sudden you have one bad member of a team ruins the whole experiment, or one person has this in their history out of the 10 people involved, and now everything's at question. So we brought in not a DNA scientist themselves, but a DNA coordinator named Darby Orcutt, who's on staff at a major university. And Darby put together teams of scientists and DNA specialists who have labs at these universities, that we weren't going to go to a university and say, out of the 20 people in your department, let's say 5 of them are like, Bigfoot, there's no way Bigfoot can be real. And 5 of them are like, oh, it has to be real. And the other 10 are neutral. I don't want there to be any bias. I want it to all be scientists and people who have an interest of it either being proven up or proven down. I don't care which way it lands. Just approach it fairly, right? Because me and Doug always did that with our research. We figured if we had a theory that we felt strongly about, we have to research that theory with the same tenacity to disprove it as we do to prove it. If we're really fairly trying to advance the science, you'll hear people say, I think 2 wood knocks followed by 3 wood knocks means this or that. That's a theory. It's not a fact. It might be something you've noticed in your area, but you've got to you got to work to prove to disprove that as hard as you do to prove it. Otherwise, it's just too easy to say, yeah, it's a fact, and it's not a fact, you know? And so the idea was to try to get these teams and then not just do it in one lab. So what Darby did is he put together teams that would take these samples in one lab and test them. And after we're done, we'd put them in a second lab with a whole different team that's unaware of what the results were in that first one. And we would do that in triplicate, not just in one lab, with 3 different teams, 3 different locations, and compare all the results so that if somebody wanted to say, well, it could have been a mistake, or there was one bad apple on that team. Well, what about the other 2 labs and those 2 separate teams? You know, there was always a safety net, so to speak, against any possible contamination of the process. So that's where we're at. And Darby's in the process of collecting more samples, not just from Northern Minnesota, but the whole idea is to catalog what we're finding. So rather than just testing a sample and saying, well, it's an unknown primate with human DNA, who knows, and set it aside, let's catalog it. That's now creature X sample 1. And now when we get a sample from Washington State and it's non-primate, part human DNA, instead of throwing that away, let's catalog that as creature X sample 2 if it matches sample 1. Until we have a body, it'll always be creature X. It's just something we've collected that sample from, right? That we don't know to exist, but it's something because it's showing up as this. And if we can get sample 1 and sample 17 and sample 122 and all these to be cataloging in different geographical areas the same DNA result, we now know that we have an unknown species that exists. We just don't know what to call it yet because we can't say it's Sasquatch. We don't have a real Sasquatch standing in front of us to pluck a hair off of and say, oh yeah, that one's the same too. So it'll always, quote, be creature X until you have a body or a sample, a live sample. But why aren't we cataloging this stuff as we go? You know, if you ladies were out in Texas and you found a hair sample and we cataloged it and it's non-human or non-primate, unknown part human DNA, the first thing I want to know, does it match the samples in the catalog? You know, let's just not have 100 different labs reach this unknown primate thing and say, we're done with that sample. We don't know what to do with it now. So that was the process designed to not. If we all went out and knocked at 3 a.m. and we got a knock back, that'd be a great experience. And we'd be talking about it on this show for weeks to come. Maybe we'd play an audio recording of it. But really, other than an experience, it's not going to advance the science. It's just a great experience. Let's go out and try to, instead of just having these experiences, let's see if we can collect DNA and start cataloging it as, I don't care if we know what it is or not. Let's see if we start seeing the same thing over and over in different areas, collected by different people.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
We can.
I got
Tammy.
it. Okay.
Tammy is here.
I fixed it, but yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. She's
So
got
yeah, as
bugs.
far as the testing goes, Tammy, that was kind of the idea, was that, we're going to, try to catalog these things. That was our first objective of this whole experience. It would have been great to get the video or an audio recording, because out of the different types of evidence, I mean, if you were going to categorize it, you could have a video or a picture, you could have an audio recording, you could have a DNA sample, and we can go down the list of for a casting or a print, would be a fourth one. Having one of those would be great. But what was so overwhelming about the PG film, despite the fact that it was that long ago, is that they had video and they had a casting. Okay, they got two of those, not just one. And had DNA technology been around, they likely would have had three of them, because they knew exactly from the video where it stepped, what it touched. We rarely have that anymore. We'll get a picture, we'll get a video, and it's not great, but we don't have it combined with a print, or we don't have it combined with a DNA sample. If we could have collected 27 or 24, 26 hair samples and 13 skin oil samples and had an audio recording all out of the same location, or combine it with a picture all out of the same location, that would have been that double whammy that we just don't seem to find anymore. I mean, we're finding castings. We get some blurry pictures now and then. We get some hair samples that we can't explain what they are through science. But when are we getting two of those at the same time, So
There is a question in the chat room. Sherry's wondering what if the higher ups lose or contaminate the sample's database storage?
So that's a good question. One, we're trusting the process that we have. One of the things of bringing Darby in is the people that are on these teams are scientists who truly have an interest in, one, protecting the integrity of what we're trying to accomplish. And that's a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I mean, I can tell you, if it comes back that these are all from some 16-year-old redhead girl who likes to go hiking every Thursday afternoon, it'd be disappointing for me, but I won't, I'd rather know that than be sitting here saying we still don't know what it is, right? So the team that he's put together are scientists who want an answer. Not that they want a no or they want a yes. They want an answer, because they feel that this is a significant enough question now that we need to come up with an answer. It's not being funded by money of people who say we've got to prove this to be true, or we've got to prove it not to be true. We have to come up with an answer.
I agree. We need some answers, and everybody's in the chat room saying that they love your approach. I am especially loving the fact that you're going to actually catalog the information from the different samples and compare them to each other. I think that should have been done a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, in the past, I've talked about getting some kind of a paper, some kind of a list going of things that we can bring with us, so we can take down information like the terrain, the temperature, the, things like that. But I never even thought about cataloging, but that's really, really smart.
So one thing you guys touched on is the cost. Obviously it's expensive. So
yeah.
We are, though, in the last couple years, we've kind of advanced to a point where, and not saying that this is a factor that everybody subscribes to, this is what we're kind of adhering to from a vetting nature. I mean, if you call Doug Hajicek or you message him on Facebook and say, I've got a hair sample, he's got 100 questions for you before he's even going to tell you to mail it to him, right? Like, where'd you collect it at? Who was with you? What were you doing that day? Were you on your way somewhere? Ask all these questions so that tomorrow, when you ask them all again, are they going to be consistent? Are they going to be the same? Are we going to throw $10,000 at one hair sample to test it on at a, that level to determine if we don't feel comfortable in the sample itself? So, obviously there's all that, but now we've also discovered that on a hair follicle, the diameter around the follicle, on the samples that we are finding that we believe to be authentic samples, they have a 5-scaled pattern around the outside. So there's 5 scales that cover the outside diameter of that hair. On humans, whether you're whether you're Swedish, whether you're Norwegian, whether you're African American, whether you're a man or a woman, you have 6 or 7 scales around the diameter of that follicle. Doesn't matter if you're redhead, blonde, whatever. There'll be 6 or 7 scales. We haven't found a hair sample that we felt confident was a Sasquatch hair sample that didn't have 5 scales around the outside of that pattern. So that's one vetting thing that we look at. Now, should that be considered by science as the way to go? No. But if you sent me a hair sample and just looking under a microscope without DNA testing, if it's got 6 or 7 sample or scales around the outside diameter, we probably aren't going to test it. The other thing is Mike Ann and Doug started, Mike Ann got turned on to something it has to do with UV light and the reflection of supposed Sasquatch hairs, as well as other mammals that we've noticed this in. And that's that if I take a UV light and shine it on that hair follicle with my naked eye, I don't see anything happen. But my naked eye I'm seeing in the vision that we see in. If I was to take my phone and video that hair follicle with that UV light on it, it will be glowing in pink. And that will happen on flying squirrels, opossums, ground squirrels, typically nocturnal mammals or burrowing mammals that live in the dark primarily. But we've also noticed that with what we suppose to be Sasquatch hair samples, that we're getting that glow reaction, just like we do with those other animals that that science has acknowledged that exists in. So there's 2 things we're going to do. You send me a hair sample, I want to know if it has 5 scales around the outside and if it glows pink under UV on a camera. I'll probably throw 10 grand at that hair sample out of my pocket to test it at that point, because it's not human.
Gotcha.
It's not a human hair.
We have to go to our commercial break, so please stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back with Jeff Harding. Awesome. You're doing great.
Thanks.
Everything that happens during the break is still going to end up on YouTube. Just warning you.
Yes, and don't forget to where you left off, Jeff, because everybody's interested. We're interested. I am really enjoying this. So
everybody is. They're loving it in the chat room.
Yes, you sound great.
And I have a question about the scales on the hair follicles.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll have the answer, but I'll try to.
I guess I'm done playing peekaboo with Skype for the day. And you can hear me now, so progress made.
That's awesome.
Yay. Tammy won.
Tammy win. Yay.
Okay.
Yeah, so we could, if you wanted to ask me about the mosquito vector study that I had done a show on the eDNA versus DNA with Darby. That's one way I want to really advance this catalog system of these samples. I think the easiest way to do it isn't trying to collect hair samples. I think it's these mosquito vector samples, and we can talk a little bit about that because I haven't ever heard another researcher talk about it. So
I found that fascinating. I did. That's why I really wanted to talk to you about that on the show. Waiting for the go. I don't know. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is the Journey Radio Show, and hey, we're the She-Squatchers. Won't you check us out online at she-squatchers.com. And there you can find out our event, what our events page is. It's not completely up to date yet, but please check it out anyway. Next week, we're going to be at the Meadowline Falls Bigfoot Festival in Meadowline Falls, Washington. It's going to be a big one, and you can come and meet us there in person. And we'll be with Ron Moorhead, David Pilates, Amy Boo with Project Zoo Book, and other people. And I guess it's a town-wide event, like a giant street fair. That's free to attend that. It only costs to get into the presentations. They had previously sold out of tickets, but they are working on a new venue that could house more people. So hopefully there will be some tickets available for that. I think the only other way you can get in at this point is to do the VIP dinner, which will automatically get you into the presentations. There are 2 VIP dinners. I think it's Friday and Saturday night. So come have dinner with us. And that'll be a fun time. And then we're going to get back with Jeff because he was on a roll sharing with us about his research and research ways, which I think are fascinating. And Tammy had a question.
I do. You're saying that the human hairs had 6 or 7 scales, and the suspected Sasquatch hairs had 5. What do other animals have as far as scales?
That's a good question. To be honest with you, I'm regurgitating this information from Doug and other scientists who have came to this conclusion. I don't know, like for instance, a white-tailed deer. I don't how many scales are around its hair, or a black bear. I'm not familiar with that. I'd like to get more familiar with that, but right now I'm just simply sharing what we know, the difference between human and what we assume to be Sasquatch hairs. And what's interesting about the Sasquatch hair samples is that up north here, we're in these colder climates where it gets extremely cold in the winter, typically we tend to believe that the hair is more follicles per square inch. It's probably a little finer and longer. If you look at depictions that are drawn by Larry Batson, who is an artist who draws what people describe that they saw, right? Seems like all the northern examples have longer hair or hair that hang down off the arms and stuff. The southern examples, and when I say southern, I mean extreme southern. We're talking Texas, Louisiana, Florida, where it's 120 degrees, 100% humidity in the summer. Typically, those animals have hair that's not any longer than mine, coarser hair, probably less per square inch, because it's not designed to insulate the body. It's designed to ventilate the body. And so these depictions of long hair, and I'm not saying that's a rule of thumb. I'm not going to say that you can't find a Florida skunk ape that's described as having longer hair around the face or something. But it seems to be a pattern when you start looking at these descriptions, that coarser, shorter hair down south, longer, finer hair up north, and then all these areas in the middle, the Ozarks and the Carolinas and Tennessee. Maybe you would see both, but there's not enough of a heat extreme or a cold extreme to really push it one direction or the other. But I think it would be hard to exist in Northern Manitoba or Saskatchewan in 40 below zero weather 4 months a year with those winds and stuff, and have short, coarse hair. I mean, it's just, there are things about the body composition, the size, that I think are different by geography. And one is the appearance of the hair, the thickness of the hair. Is it designed to insulate or ventilate? or is it from one of these, more common in the middle areas where it doesn't get extremely cold or extremely hot? Maybe you see representations of both. But the other thing would be just like white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer in Alabama, a fully matured 7-year-old buck is probably 180 pounds. And up here in northern Minnesota or the Dakotas, a fully matured white-tailed deer is pushing 300 pounds. It's the same species, different forage base, different climates, different, they just grow differently. They're sized differently. So the idea that one could be 1,200 pounds and 10 foot tall in Canada or the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, that idea is that throughout those cold, extremely cold months, the anabolic rate, the amount of calories that are exuded, the energy it would take to move is completely different than what it would be in that extreme southern climate. So maybe that makes sense that you hear depictions of them not really much taller than 8.5 foot way down south. They aren't typically described as being over 800 or 900 pounds. I mean, that's like the max. Whereas up north, you hear them 10 foot tall, over 1,000 pounds, Well, they're two different climates and two different ways to exist as far as energy levels and metabolic rates and all of that. So it would make sense that an individual might be bigger in that colder climate.
But that does make a lot of sense to me.
And Jen, what do you tell people? It's
so
survival.
When we're traveling and speaking at conventions in the South where it's usually hot, I tell them, it gets 50 below where I live. It's survival of the thickest up here. It's survival of the thickest. We need this.
And people laugh but you're right. Depending on where the area,
there's a lot of differences in geography too when you look at what's the apex predator that they would consider a threat, right? In Florida, you've got alligators, you've got some black bears, you've got some pumas or some cougars down there, but for the most part, those really aren't a huge threat. I mean, they're either easy to avoid. 999 times out of 1,000, a mountain lion is going to run away from you rather than run towards you. Okay. The real threat way up north isn't even a grizzly bear, because I don't think a grizzly bear, I think they're smart enough to realize, hey, I don't need to get into this crap. Why would I do it? Right. The real threat is things like a pack of wolves. 8 or 10 wolves working in a pack. I don't care if you're 10 foot tall and 1,200 pounds. You are in trouble at that point. So the idea that they may have to exist in clans or groups of 6 or 8 individuals to be able to survive and defend themselves against those types of threats versus maybe down south, you could have 2 or 3 of them in a group and they can defend themselves fine and exist fine. And if you think about that, you hear people describing the skunk ape and some of these southern encounters as being kind of not friendly, like they're a little angrier or a little more unsettled, so to speak. And I don't know if there's any truth to that, but by human nature, it would make sense. If the 4 of us worked as a group, we'd learn to communicate with each other very well. If there was 8 or 10 of us, the likelihood of somebody feeling like they need to, we need each other. So like up north where you have packs of wolves and things like that as your apex predator, your biggest threat, you need to work together. You need each other. You can't survive alone. So you're tolerant of that bigger group. You learn to get along with that bigger group. Where you have 2 or 3 individuals where if one was alone, they're probably going to be okay. I mean, there isn't a threat out there that exists that they need 4 or 5 individuals to ward off, so to speak. So maybe existing in smaller groups makes them a little less tolerant, if that makes sense. maybe that would lead to a poor disposition and how you would react to a threat. I don't know. I mean, like I said, I don't want to present that as a fact, but to me, it's a plausible explanation as to why they might exist in groups of 6 to 8, 9 of them in a family group versus 2 or 3 down south. You need that bigger number to survive. But
that makes sense to me. Before we run out of time, though, I did want to ask you about the idea of using mosquitoes to collect DNA samples.
So this is something that I had done a show with Darby. We had talked about the difference between DNA and eDNA, because there's a lot of misperception as far as what can eDNA, what can you test, what can't you test, what works and what doesn't work, right? And in researching this, I found this university that was part of a big project last year. They published it last year in April. They did it the year leading up to it in California, where they had people it was in Alameda County, and they had some scientists from Sweden. They had people from this university. They had people with the let's see here. They had the United States Department of Biochemistry and Biophysics involved, the University of California, San Francisco. What they were trying to test is the transfer of viruses from one animal to another through vectors like mosquitoes. Like, could a mosquito land on a deer who's infected with a virus, take a blood meal, and 2 days later land on a different animal that's not affected by that virus and infect it? That's what it was designed to do. And they were looking at animals, specifically mule deer, cattle, fox, rabbits, things that were in. They tested 2 areas. One was a marsh area and one was kind of a prairie grass area. Neither of them were seriously that remote. They weren't far from the city. There were some walking trails in both these areas, so humans would be there. They put mosquito traps out and trapped like a couple hundred mosquitoes in one night in each of these areas. And just to put it in layman's terms, they'd take a mosquito and put it in a food processor, so to speak. I mean, it mashed it up. And first they'd identify what type of mosquito it is, because there was a couple different types. They didn't want to confuse that. But they, instead of just like taking a little needle and taking a little blood droplet out, they'd mash it up. They'd determine the DNA of the mosquito and separate that and look at the DNA of that puree, so to speak, and figure out what was the host of that blood meal. Was it a mule deer? Was it a cow? Was it a rabbit? And what they were doing is, because they were studying the transfer of viruses amongst these animals, they really didn't care about the humans, right? 25% of these mosquito samples that they had tested were human. And what did they do? They just threw them away, because we don't need those human ones. We're just testing the mule deer and the cows, right? And that got me thinking, what happens if you get, your normal mosquito can fly 10 to 20 miles in its lifetime, okay? Some people say up to 40 if the winds are right and things, but for the most part, it's 1 to 10 miles is the most common. What if we went up to an island like I had my encounter on in Northern Manitoba that's 75 miles from the nearest tank trail or town, okay? And we go there with mosquito gear on, and we put that collection device out there. It emits CO2 from a tank. They swarm into a deal and they're caught in it. And we collect them samples and we bring them back and test them. What I would be curious is do the opposite of what they did. If we can get DNA returns that are not unknown primate, part human, I don't care about the black bear, the grizzly bear, the moose, the white-tailed deer. Throw all them away. I want to look at the ones. Would it be easier to get, rather than trying to collect a hair off a ball like I did, would it be easier to collect 300 mosquitoes in a couple hours and look at 300 things that they all had a blood meal off of in the last 48 hours and test that DNA? To me, that would be killing way more birds with each stone, you know what I mean? And I don't know, it's an expensive proposition, but if you're really serious about advancing the science and you want to expand this catalog in a huge fashion, once you've got the base catalog built from LMS2 and Darby's further research and other people contributing to it, what happens if we go out and collect 500 mosquitoes from location A, 500 from another location, 500 another location, and we keep testing them, and every time we find an unknown primate part human DNA, we say, does it match anything in the catalog? That would be easier than leaving red balls in fields in places. And so I don't know if anybody's ever thought about trying to do this, but this is science that they're already doing right now. And they're even doing it on a bigger scale right now because they're trying to figure out with COVID, certain animals are catching this. I mean, we've had 2 snow leopards that died at our local zoo here from COVID. And they're actually giving animals vaccines for COVID right now at these zoos. And so as they're now really, you think about why did they do that study with virus transfer then? Think about all the studies that are on the maps on universities across all over right now that are planning on looking at what animals can get this virus, how easy is it to transfer, how prevalent is it in different areas. They're all going to be doing these similar vector studies already. So now I don't even need to fund the study. I just need to tell them, oh, by the way, if you find a non-human or a part human, unknown primate DNA return, don't throw it away. Please give it to me. These are studies that are going to be done anyways. It's just getting it coordinated to do that, I would be concerned about doing it in like metro areas or anywhere that humans are hiking and stuff. I think the best way to do it would get so remote that there is no plausible explanation why there would be a human DNA sample in any of those mosquitoes. And then start looking at those first. But to me, that would be a great approach to trying to expand that catalog with unknown primate part DNA samples.
I love this idea. I can't wait to see where that goes. I hope you can take it and run with it because I think that's a winner right there.
I second that.
In Minnesota especially, the mosquito is practically our state bird.
Yeah, it is our state bird.
And they have appetites too, let me tell you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because the mosquitoes in Virginia Beach, you can't even feel when they bite you. And you don't even know you got bit until it starts itching.
Really?
Here in northern Minnesota, you'll roast a marshmallow over the fire and put it on a graham cracker with a piece of chocolate, and a mosquito will fly by and just grab it right out of your hand.
Now that is funny.
They get pretty big.
Yes, they do. And some of them, I mean, it's weird because I've gotten bit by a mosquito where I could barely feel it, and I've gotten ones that were just awful. Like you could feel it immediately, and I was like, "What is the difference?" I didn't know at the time that I was noticing the difference in bites. That there are different kinds of mosquitoes. I didn't know, but that probably is the difference.
Yeah, I didn't notice, how many different kinds there were really. I don't know geographically. Like maybe if you go 100 miles north of Flin Flon in Manitoba and Saskatchewan on that border, maybe there is only one kind. Maybe there's 20 kinds. I have no clue. But once you set your baseline and understand what you're likely to capture in a trap like that, and you understand all the different animals that are in that area that are likely to be blood samples for a mosquito, you now know what to look for that isn't normal. I mean, maybe you don't even know how defied it would be that it's unknown primate, part human DNA. But I know when it's not a wolf and it's not a coyote, it's not a moose, it's not a black bear. You start Xing off all those things, and what you're left with is we don't have a comparable match. Again, you're starting at that catalog number is, okay, we'll put that one on the corner of the table and let's see how many more we can get that look like that, right? As far as I know, nobody's ever done that. The closest is this study, and because they weren't looking for any, they were so specific about wanting to see with mule deer and these different animals that anything they got that didn't fit in their box, they just threw away.
Interesting. I'd had a question in my head and now it's gone. That doesn't happen very often. Do you have any? Oh, go ahead, Jenna.
I actually have a question. So out of all those samples that you've talked about, can you tell us if, like, what percentage of those samples were actually something that would be, how would I say it? Something that would be consistent with Bigfoot?
Well, you're talking about in the study they did in California?
No, what you've got as far as all of your hair samples.
Okay,
and the oils and
the samples that we got appear to be 5 scale samples around the diameter. They appear to have little to no medulla core in them. They're somewhat transparent. They look like whiskey and water, so to speak. They're just like a watered down bourbon color, but I can see through it very clearly. If I put a light behind it and then hold that hair up to that light with a light behind it, and in between the hair and the light, put a pin, I can see that black line coming across the hair. So, I mean, coming behind the hair, I should say. So, I mean, it is completely translucent.
So are all of these samples you're getting, are these samples coming out to be conclusive?
They haven't been completed in the lab yet.
Oh, okay.
So what we're doing right now is not just the samples that I had collected in that area. Our goal was to put together samples from several different geographical areas in the North America. And so we're working with researchers in Washington State, researchers in Oklahoma, trying to get hair samples. And actually, Darby on his website, I apologize, I don't have the link, but I'll tell you what, I'll go to your YouTube. When you post this on YouTube, I'll post in the comments a link to his deal, because he's going to have where you can go on his site and click on, he's going to have a button, a tab for a sample, and it will ask you a questionnaire. And so that you know, if you've got a sample that you really feel this is a Sasquatch hair sample, you don't need to spend the $10,000. Send it in. We're trying to secure the funding to pay the bill for all of the testing we're doing, but we're also, because of the way we're doing it in a lab where maybe we aren't paying retail 10 grand per sample. We're working with scientists who really want to determine whether this is real or not. Let's get some finality to this. And so versus 100 people with each one with a sample going to 100 different labs and paying a bill, let's do it all in one shot. But let's get all these samples lined up and put them all in the same catalog.
That sounds great. The music says we're at the end of the show. I want to thank Jeff Harding for coming on. Please subscribe to his YouTube channel at Pine Island Research. And also remember to subscribe to our channel at She-Squatchers Official. Facebook and Instagram.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. I can't stop moving.